Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Diverse Talk Matters. To talk about different things around diversity, equity, inclusion, talk about things that people may find challenges with, so we hope you find them really useful. Some are around people's different lived experiences, some really challenging conversation, things that sometimes we don't need to talk about. But we really hope you enjoy the range of topics that we are introducing to you or bringing to you, to your homes, to your house, to your workplaces. We hope you enjoy.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Diverse Matters podcast. So today we're going to be talking about all things intersectionality. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. There's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to discuss. Yeah, let's dive right into it. So Sim, thank you for coming along and welcome. Can you give us an introduction to who you are and how you're involved with Diverse Matters?
Absolutely. Like you've already said, my name's Sim. So I'm Sim Fitzgerald. My pronouns are she and they. So I use them interchangeably. And I am one of the consultants with Diverse Matters. So I do all things diversity, equity, and inclusion. But my background is, oh crikey, I've been doing this for quite a long time now. I did my first, undergrad, first foray into this work in 2004. My specialist area, if I were to go on Mastermind, would be race and ethnicity. So I've got a master's in race and ethnicity. And I also trained as a feminist coach, which is not just a coach who's a feminist. It is a coach who applies an anti-oppressive lens in the way that I work that takes into account our position within the system as well. So this is absolutely the kind of stuff I love to talk about. I'm a bit worried that this podcast episode is going to be several hours long, but yeah, let's get into it.
I do genuinely feel like this could be a part 1, part 2, part 3, especially in the pre-call that we had. It was one of the longer ones because there's so much to unpack here. But who knows? We're going to scratch the surface and see what happens. But hey, if there's a part 2 that needs to happen, we'll make it happen. Okay, thank you so much. Can you give us the history of intersectionality and specifically how Dr. Kimberle Crenshaw penned the term, what was going on then? So yeah, a history and description for us.
Sure. So to start off, this is my understanding of intersectionality, is it's all about the way that our different social identities, so that could be our gender, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, age, all of these different social identities that we hold, how they come together and compound our experiences of discrimination. So it is a term that was coined by Dr. Kimberle Crenshaw, 1989. So it was quite a long time ago. It was quite an obscure term up until it feels like quite recently. There's been this massive resurgence talking about it. But it's been around since 1989. And Dr. Crenshaw was a legal scholar, so it came from the legal sphere. And there is one example that she uses in the original academic. There's 3 examples, but I'll give you one example of a case that she used as an example within the original academic paper. And that was the case of DeGraffenreid versus General Motors. And it was a case from 1976 brought by 5 black women who sued General Motors for a policy that they said targeted black women specifically. So a bit of context around this. In the 1970s in the US, there was a recession. There were mass layoffs and General Motors were no different. But they based their layoffs on seniority. So it was a bit of a first in, first out type policy. The issue was that General Motors hadn't actually hired any black women until 1964. So what happened was that every single black woman who worked for General Motors at the time was laid off simply because they were newest at the company. And what happened in this case was that the judge ruled in favor of General Motors because they essentially said that you can't treat black women as a kind of separate protected class. I think they might have used the word Pandora's box. If it's going to do that, it's going to be a Pandora's box where every minoritized community is going to start making all these claims. But the kind of evidence that they used for that, and I'm using little kind of bunny ears around the word evidence was they said not all white women were laid off, so it wasn't sexism, and not all black men were laid off, so it wasn't racism. And the point that Dr. Crenshaw was making is that by treating black women as only women or only black, it kind of ignored the specific challenges of both. I'm going to paraphrase a quote. I feel like I'm going to get it wrong, but it was something like, the experience is greater than the sum of racism plus sexism. So there's this space that isn't just two things added together. It's those two parts compounding and creating an entirely third new experience out of it as well. Intersectionality is not, it's not an additive. It's not like I'm this and this, therefore I experience these three separate issues. It's the way that those issues come together and create a different experience. And it's also not about identity and how we feel. That's how it's come to be talked about, right? It's talked about in the context of, here's how I feel about myself. Dr. Crenshaw was talking about it in terms of the position within the wider system. So we're talking about structural inequality here, rather than identity and representation. Does that sum it up?
I think that sums it up really wonderfully, and it's really interesting how it's about your position and therefore your relation to power rather than identity. It's a thing with these phrases, these terms, they evolve and they're developed and they're made into what makes sense for people in the time. But that's a really interesting aspect that I didn't know about the origins of intersectionality in that way. But it makes sense. It makes sense.
I should say that Dr. Crenshaw coined but the idea was around already. So you've got people like Bell Hooks, people like Audre Lorde. They were talking about this idea already. So it was just that Kimberle Crenshaw put a label on it and developed the ideas into what we now call intersectionality.
So often language is important. I find it can make it so much easier that when explaining that to anyone else, when describing the situation, helping people to identify like instances within their own situation as well. So it's always, I find it always useful to have the language. And then there's still folks that are brand new to the concept and brand new to what it's about. And there can be a lot of tension with that difference in learning, right? And especially these days when, you know, everything seems to be so polarizing, Sim. It's yes or no, it's black or white, it's this or that. And very, very dangerous in some spaces, specifically in social media when we're talking about people's opinions being so polarizing. And it's across all aspects of society, right? Yes, I know that these podcasts are focusing on the workplace, but it spills in. And one of the things that I'm hearing about intersectionality, one of the phrases is this phrase of oppression Olympics. Well, if I've got this and this, therefore I have more say. Or if I've got this and this, or if you have this and that, it's separated. It's like, it's almost like who's got the checklist of oppression and who can, if you tick as many boxes, therefore you have a better say, or you have more say or more power in the situation. And it's almost who has it worse off, playing it off each other at times. So for me, this aspect of power and privilege is really interesting with intersectionality. You know, with the way that our multiple identities are intertwined when it's societally or in the workplace, workplaces still seem to struggle with this. And so what I'd be really curious to hear from you is, how can workplaces get more comfortable with these conversations to enable empathy pathways when we're talking about intersectionality in the workplace?
I think one of the things that makes this so difficult is that it feels very much we're working from many different definitions of intersectionality. I don't think there is a shared understanding of what it is. There's the definition of intersectionality as Dr. Crenshaw meant it. There's the definition of it as it is on social media, where it's like it can get a little bit like nobody else is allowed to talk because I'm the most oppressed. It can get into this oppression Olympics. And then you have the definition from the kind of backlash side of things, the kind it's woke nonsense, that kind of thing. And everybody's coming at this with a completely different understanding. And I get why people might feel like the concept of intersectionality is causing more division, but it's because we don't have a shared understanding of it. So I think one of the first things about getting more comfortable is to actually understand it, because when you understand intersectionality, it actually helps to create empathy pathways rather than causing division. So there's a little bit of myth busting to be done, isn't there? Because if you see intersectionality almost like a pyramid with, it's true, structurally, some people are higher up the pyramid and some people are lower down the bottom. But if we treat it as a competition as to who's the most oppressed, when you interpret it that way, you can see how some people might think that intersectionality is about turning the pyramid on its head. That what we're saying is that essentially, if you are a white, cisgender, non-disabled, middle-class, heterosexual man, you are never allowed to talk about anything ever, and you're never allowed to have nice things. But actually, intersectionality is meant as a lens. It's meant to help you. It's meant to aid understanding. It's meant to help you to analyze what's going on and really understand the problem so that you can eradicate that social hierarchy. So the pyramid doesn't even need to be there. That's what the intention is. And I think having that shared understanding has got to be the kind of starting point of that. I think we also need to get comfortable with navigating nuance a little bit, because we want to have these very like black and white rules about things. And I get it, because it's like, I can feel when I say D, I mean diversity, equity and inclusion. It can feel like a really challenging topic. It can feel so tricky. It feels to some people like a minefield where it's quite anxiety inducing sometimes. And so I get why you want to have these really clear cut rules. It is this and it's not that. But we need to get comfortable with being able to hold two truths at the same time that might feel like they're opposing. For example, it is true. There should be space for everybody within the workplace, that everyone's view should be heard, irrespective of who you are, irrespective of what social identities you hold. And at the same time, we also need to proactively make space for some groups because they historically haven't been given that. So it's learning to deal with and be comfortable with nuance and complexities around it.
And the thing with nuance and complexity, I find it's often experienced, right? That can be quite difficult, can't it, to lean into being uncomfortable, especially in that workplace where you want to show or may feel that you have to show that you've got all your ducks in a row and you know what you're doing. And I'm thinking about the leaders in these workplaces. Get comfortable in that uncertainty when they're developing that nuance muscle.
I think there is a little bit of looking at what leadership means. So there's this idea of leadership that you know what you're doing, you always know what to do, you are the one that is right, you have the best ideas, the right ideas, all those kinds of things. And actually, let's look at, because leadership is as much about listening and facilitating and all those kind of, let's call them soft skills that have been directly devalued, I think. But yeah, it is about being able to listen, and also having some humility as well, because, and mixed into this is what's really common in workplaces is to have lack of equity in terms of the further up the hierarchy you go, it tends to get whiter it tends to get more male, it tends to get more middle class. People with dominant social identities tend to be more likely to be in leadership positions. And with those dominant identities come a certain amount of privilege and power. And the thing about privilege is it stops you from seeing other perspectives. It stops you from seeing any other realities outside your own sphere. You just think that you think of your own experience as just the human experience. You don't see it in its context as, well, actually, this is my experience. This is my lens on the world as a person who holds this particular position within a wider system. And so that's where the empathy comes in. That's where the humility and the listening needs to come in, because you need to be able to broaden your worldview. It's okay if you don't know what every other experience might look like. I think as a starting point, you just need to be open to the idea that your experience isn't a universal, that there are other experiences. And so it becomes about listening, but also asking questions. What am I not seeing here? What barriers have we inadvertently been putting in place for different groups? Let me hear all your views. I think that's how you can start to build those empathy pathways and create something that works for, I'd love to say works for everyone. That's where we want to get to.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sim. It can be tough, especially when we're talking about privilege, we're talking about experience, we're talking about having the perspective or credible perspectives of what that may look like. So again, making sure that this is as useful as possible. Like, what does thinking and acting with an intersectional lens, what does it look like in practice in the workplace? In terms of the work that you've done over the many years that you've been making workplaces better, what are good examples that you've seen of this?
So the clearest example, the easiest, I think the one that would help people to grasp it the most is around pay gap reporting. When we're looking at pay gap reporting, and obviously some organisations now are legally required to do this, some smaller organisations are doing it anyway just because they feel that it's the right thing to do. When we're looking at pay gap reporting, we tend to just focus on the difference in pay between men and women. I feel like I need to acknowledge that obviously non-binary identities exist as well at this point. But we tend to focus on the difference in pay between men and women when we're looking at the gender pay gap. And the thing is, Mikayla, I knew you were going to ask for a practical example. So I went digging into the data because the data shows that it's not actually that simple. Because when you start to look with an intersectional lens, you're not getting the whole picture if you just look at gender. So for example, I looked at, there's some kind of a bit more recent figures from the Office for National Statistics. So the most recent I could find was 2019. I think probably a pandemic got in the way of them doing some more kind of research into this. But what it found was that the pay gap was different. The gender pay gap was different when you also looked at ethnicity as well. So the pay gap between men and women is huge, actually, within certain ethnicities. Indian men are paid £4.08 more than Indian women. And when I use the term Indian, this is self-identified in the census. But for African, Caribbean and Black British men and women, the difference is only 6p. So you can see that there is so much that is hidden when you just look at gender. It's also different between ethnicities. Again, this is ONS data from 2019. The lowest paid group out of everybody, if we're looking at ethnicity and gender together, is mixed white and Black Caribbean women. So they earn, this one shocked me. They earn £7.22 per hour than white Irish women. So there's differences between ethnicities and between women. You could do this you could think about disability in this. I don't I did have a look for pay data around disability. I couldn't really find it, but I have seen some data that shows that disabled men are less likely to be employed than non-disabled women. So again, to reiterate, this is not about who's got it worse, and let's start getting into a competitive, actually, this group's got it worse than this group. It's about understanding the problem. It's about understanding the problem so that we can come up with better solutions. If we only understand pay gap reporting through the lens of gender, and we say men earn more than women, because that is true overall, that's the overall picture, we might try and solve just for that problem and that problem alone. What do we do about the fact that women don't earn as much as men? And if we take that approach, the gender pay gap can never be closed, because it also intersects with disability, probably sexual orientation, probably age. I'm saying probably only because I haven't dug into the data. It wouldn't surprise me if that's the situation. Gender pay gap reporting can be a really useful tool, but you can make it so much more powerful if you use an intersectional lens on it. So in practical terms, that might mean disaggregating the data. That might mean looking at pay by gender and then by ethnicity, or pay by gender and then by disability. What happens? What does that data tell you? I get that there is a challenge around that. It's a challenge for small organisations, because obviously if you've not got that many staff, the data starts getting meaningless if you keep trying to break it into ever smaller kind of components. And it's also perhaps a challenge for organisations that don't have much diversity. But I would say that even without the exact data for your organisation, you can still use an intersectional lens. When you're looking at your gender pay gap data, you could still be asking, is this hiding some nuance? I can tell you the answer already. It's going to be yes. And save you some time. It will be hiding something. And your job will be to have an honest discussion about what might this be hiding and what are we going to do about it?
Thank you, Sim. Those are the important questions that folks need to be asking themselves, right, in the workplace. Okay, this is what we see and what we're going to do about it. We can't unlearn this, we can't unsee this, we can't unexperience this. So how do we then move forward with what we now know? And that will take time. That is a journey, and that's going to be and will need to be a constant evolution in that. And I just want to reassure folks that's okay. You're not supposed to have all the answers on day one. If that was the case, we wouldn't even be here. This podcast wouldn't be necessary, because we'd be like, oh, it's done, it's dealt with. We don't need to. Yeah. But there does need to be that understanding that this is going to take time. Ideas evolve, understanding evolves, but there has to be the intention.
Yeah. I would love for people to walk away from this podcast with, I'd love for them to just start asking questions. That's the very first step, is just go, I wonder. There's questions to be asked here. And I think that's what intersectionality can give you as a starting point, is what questions do I ask? And the question, is this the same for everybody? Because it won't be. And exactly as you say, the expectation isn't that you then solve this overnight, but you've got to start by understanding the problem and seeing what the problem is. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is that it's hard to see. It's hard to see what the problems are. Why would you see what the problems are if you're seeing this from just your perspective? So it goes back to that listening and understanding and having some humility and as a leader and all those kinds of things.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sim. I want to continue on with this notion of evolution and of journey, because The Mikayla that sits in front of you right now is very different to the Mikayla 10 years ago, which is very different to the Mikayla 10 years before that, right? There's an evolution in my understanding, my learning, my experience of people, my experience of myself. And that naturally has to happen, right? Even with a dedication to the work that I'm doing now, the evolution in my thinking, the evolution in how I approach has changed because of the development in over those years. And I'd be really curious to understand moments that you've noticed your evolution in understanding, especially as we think about there may be some people who are at the very beginning stages of understanding intersectionality, and it may feel like a massive uphill battle. But what are the sorts of things that can help others in developing their understanding that helped you develop your understanding in this space?
It's funny you say that about evolving, because obviously I've evolved too. And I think about when I look back sort of 5 years and I think about how I thought and how I understood things and the things I said, that they lacked quite a lot of nuance, let's be honest. I look back at me 5 years ago and I feel a bit embarrassed about, I think, oh, what was I thinking? And I know in 5 years' time, if I listen back to this podcast episode, I'll probably go, oh, Sim, what were you talking about? That's so embarrassing now. It's part of I think for me, that's a sign of evolution, isn't it? When you look back at the things from 5 years ago and you see how far you've come. I think for me, it has been about my understanding really kind of evolved when I tried to separate all these different definitions of intersectionality. What is the original meaning? How has it come to be used? How is it interpreted when there's this backlash to it? And for me, it's been about my biggest evolution has come from asking questions, because to be honest with you, there was a time where I'd see things on social media and I would take it as a given. Oh, that's what that means because that's what everyone says it means on social media. But then at some point, I went, really, how does this apply in the real world? Because I've seen this situation here, this scenario in the workplace where I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't really make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me that all these people are privileged and always hold power and all these people are always marginalized and don't hold any power. That seems too binary to me. So I just through scenarios that I've come across found that it, by constantly thinking about the application of these ideas, it raised some questions on me, which then pointed me in the direction of where to go and learn, if that makes sense. That prompted me. I'm not one for making recommendations about read this book and then that book and then you will understand intersectionality. I find that if you follow your gut, your intuition about which pathways to follow around your learning, you get in rabbit holes, don't you? You find yourself, you start on one path and then you go, that sparked this thought for me. I've got this other question. What can I now go and read? What can I learn? Who can I speak to about this? So it's been quite an organic thing for me, but fundamentally it's been about, I guess I'm talking about critical thinking really, aren't I? It questions when I hear new information, letting it sit and thinking, okay, I've become aware of this thing now. What does that actually mean for me? What does that mean in the context of the work that I do? How do you actually apply this in practice? What are the challenges with that? What more do I need to learn? I think on an organizational level, so if we're talking about the workplace, as I said at the start or near the start, there is a need for a shared understanding as a starting point. I think it's very difficult to think about your practical application in the context of your organization if everyone thinks that intersectionality means something different. So that is where I would start, is if you are at the very beginning of your journey, is what does an intersectional approach actually mean, and making sure that everybody has a shared understanding of that. I guess a starting point could be training, and it'd be really rude of me not to mention that Diverse Matters offer intersectionality training as well that can support your organization to come up with that shared understanding of intersectionality and look at, okay, what does this actually mean?
So what I'm curious about is to understand that training a little bit. What are the components of that training? What can folks expect?
Yeah. So on training, we would dive into this a little bit more in depth. So you get a deeper understanding of how it actually changes the experience. So we've talked about the fact that it does change our experience, our position in society, and that kind of comes into the workplace as well, of course. But on the training, we would delve into what are the ways that it changes our experience of the workplace? How does it change our experiences of a policy? How does it change our experiences of recruitment and progression? How does it change our experiences of any number of things that happen within the workplace? So we dig into that a little bit. We take some time to understand more about why it's so important to consider intersectionality, get everybody on board. There's a piece here about making sure that we're winning hearts and minds about why this is the approach that we want to be taking, giving people the understanding and the skills to be able to apply an intersectional lens. And then looking at some practical examples and what it means for your organization. How does this relate to strategy? How does it relate to policy development? How does it relate to recruitment, to your communications, to all of these different things? So what does it mean for your specific role?
Thank you, Sim. Okay, that's good to know. And for organizations that are at the beginning, or maybe some organizations that need to sharpen their skills, it sounds like there's something for everyone to learn from and to hear a little bit more. Sim, I really enjoyed the conversation. So I want to thank you for your time today and sharing all that you have. And yeah, is there anything else that you'd like to let people know about?
Really, just thank you for having me, because I love talking about this stuff, but you don't want to be the bore, do you? If you start getting into it when you just out for a coffee with your mates, everyone starts slowly backing away from you. So it's been nice to properly talk about it. And I hope that people have found it useful and it started the journey of you thinking about developing that intersectional lens. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So they're the top tips that I would say that I've taken from what Sim has spoken about is this podcast episode. It's that consideration of critical thinking, questioning, and taking your time and working together and having that clear base of what intersectionality is or what it means in your workplace, and taking things from there and making sure that everyone's on that journey with you as you move forward in that. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sim.
Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. Please do spread the word about our channel and tune in for our next episode.